Okay, this is another edition of Quackaholics Anonymous where I upload every 2 weeks and I build a case where I believe AA is a harmful, dangerous religious cult with no net benefits whatsoever, even with the minor social connections you might make in there. And I have plenty of evidence to back this up, as well as pointing out logical fallacies, logical inconsistencies, and showing where AA is not even remotely scientifically valid. And if it weren't for the stranglehold the treatment center community has over most of the recovery narrative, that AA would have already faded out and died away. And each week I have a different topic that I try to explore, but there is also a core message of you don't need a program to quit drinking or to get over your addiction. You are not diseased, you are not in full flight from reality, you are not sick as your secrets, and you don't need to surrender to win. In this particular week, we're going to be revisiting some old friends of ours, Socrates, Plato, and a few others. And we're going to talk about the way language can be framed in rhetoric as a form of not just persuasion, but manipulation. But before I do that, I'm going to start out with my usual shout outs to other content creators who challenge the AA narrative. We have Contempt Upon Investigation. We have Emma's Groupthink Podcast. We have Bobby C., Anonymous Addiction. Sobriety, Bestie, who I did a collaboration with recently. I don't know if you've seen the video or not, where it was just the two of us kind of hanging out and talking. I had a lot of fun doing that. And Burn the Stigma with Tara Grace, who also does the Recovery Rebellion podcast. And hopefully I have an upcoming collaboration with her as well. I think I might even be able to get one going as soon as next week if I get the time off work and everything to do with it. I got some books from both Dan Joyce and Dee Dee Stout in the video description below, and I'm trying to see if I missed anybody. I think I got everybody today, included Thrive Alcohol Recovery. If I didn't mention her earlier, I'm mentioning her now with Katie. She talks about the Sinclair method, which is a pretty evidence-based, reliable path to moderate drinking or even quitting drinking altogether. It is not for everyone, but it's not a religious cult either, so it's not going to tell you that you're just not honest if it doesn't work for you. If it doesn't work for you, they tell you to find a different method or to use a different approach. As a matter of fact, I have an upcoming video where I want to talk about something called Bayesian analysis, which is not as complicated as it sounds. In fact, most of us are engaging in it already. But I will get to that later because I think it can actually help people break their addictions. It's something that I recently read about. But anyway, without losing the plot and without getting off script, because I have a tendency to meander and wander and start making pop culture references, which I'm probably going to do today anyway, I'm going to dive right in to the topic at hand. So we're going to have to go time traveling again. We're going to have to go back to Plato, Socrates, and the democracy that was going on in Athens at the time, which, believe it or not, the democracy of Athens, ancient Athens, was a fairly well, stable, functioning democracy. As a matter of fact, I'm not saying it was perfect by any means, especially not by today's standards, because there was slavery, there were women who could not vote, but in terms of having an actual free republic, it was quite effective and quite well done. As a matter of fact, I was about to say it was almost remarkably similar to the democracy of today, but then again, what's going on outside in the world right now doesn't really seem like a democracy anymore at all. And I don't want to get started on that because it'll become a political video. But there were guys in ancient Athens who could make anything sound true. And you've heard people on the news media or podcasters or even in comment sections on toxic places talking about you're engaging in sophistry. Well, this is nothing but sophistry. Well, there's a reason what that word means. It's more or less just saying you can make anything sound true. You can say a lot without saying anything. You can obfuscate points, etc. But I do want to point out that going back to ancient Athens or even ancient Rome, when it comes to people who were orators, and I'm talking about people, even the philosophers, when it comes to people who had to make a case and had to explain why they believed what they believed, and they had to provide a convincing argument for it. If you took any of those guys, if you went back then and you plucked them all out from that time period, of course, if you did bring them here, they'd probably be saying, what the hell are these little tiny things that everybody's fidgeting around with called phones? But if you took those guys and you put them up against any of the modern politicians of today, or any of the social media influencers, or even the professional debaters, those guys would probably decimate opponents in an argument. I don't think too many people of today would be able to stand up to say someone like a Cicero or someone like a Plato or any of them, because these people studied language. They studied everything about it all the time in every interaction. Then they studied tones of voice. They studied hand gestures. They studied what's convincing to people, what's not convincing to people, what turns people off, what draws people in. And the early guys who were masters of this actually believed this was a useful tool, an art form, to find a reliable pathway to truth. They thought, if I have an idea, and I believe that idea can be demonstrated as reality, or a case for why I think this is the way it is, they knew that it wouldn't work to just get up on a stage somewhere and say, well, I think it should be like this. They knew that they were going to have to be able to deliver the idea in a way that people would be able to understand them, that people would be able to think, that people would be able to ponder about it. They wanted to put something in your head when they were talking about it in a way that when you walked away from hearing them talk, you were not necessarily fanatical believers, like Bill W. talks about. Many of us had philosophical convictions. Well, a philosophical conviction is meant to be debated. It's meant to be argued about. It's meant to be countered. It's not telling you what to do and obey and all of that other kind of thing. Because even if you heard one of these guys talk and you didn't agree with a single thing that the person was saying, you would be able to walk away thinking about what they said and think, this is why I don't agree with what they're saying. This is why I have a problem with what they're saying. Versus Bill W., who just commands you to believe a certain way and you're not even allowed to disagree with the son of a bitch about it. But there were a group of guys who appeared on the scene around this time, and they called themselves sophists. They were masters of persuasion. They were literally like merchants of language. Now, where the philosophers like Plato or Socrates, we don't really know Socrates because we don't have anything he wrote down. We have what is written about him. We'd have had a problem with this is because they weren't using this very art form that I'm just talking about how to speak, how to persuade, how to get your point across, and what to say. They studied this also, but to them, this was not about trying to find out what's true. This wasn't about trying to persuade anyone about anything. This was literally, this is how you can use words to do whatever you want with people. There was a famous one who's in Plato's dialogues that was historically known to say, just give me a topic. I'm a sophist. Give me a topic. Even if I don't know a whole lot about it, just give me one. And tell me what you would like me to do with it. For instance, if I said, can you convince people why this political hot button issue is pertinent and why we should all vote for it, he would do it. But if I told him, okay, now turn around and convince us why it's not a good thing to vote for, he could do that too. He could do whatever that you ask him to do for a price. And people paid him. And people paid a lot of these sophists to be taught how to do this because they studied this. They studied speaking. They studied everything about when to pause, when to raise your voice, when to lower your voice, when to look angry, when to look passionate, when to wring your hands. So they would be able to, like I said, pretty much decimate most of us in the modern world when it comes to any kind of debate or something like that. But the sophists were not interested in truth. They were just interested in winning a debate, and they didn't care how they won it. They would use emotional manipulation. They would use anything, and they were for sale. And if for a price, they could teach you how to do this too. And one of the most famous sophist debates that it was preserved in history, I was reading about it, was where a man got up and he convinced people, and won this debate, by the way, that it's impossible to tell a lie, that you cannot tell a lie. His case was, in order to speak a lie, you have to describe something that doesn't exist. Since it's impossible to describe something that doesn't exist, it's impossible to tell a lie. And he actually won that debate. But I want to show you today, because I could keep going in the history lesson here, how the sophists ended up bringing about a lot of corruption in government, and how, politicians could hire a sophist. Hey, I need you to convince the people to do this. And some sophists were motivated by greed to say, well, you know what? I'd like to make money doing this, so I'm just going to convince the government to go this way, because this will benefit me, even if it means going to war, even if it means something that could cause a famine. It'll benefit me greatly, so I can do this. But this legacy kind of lives on, although it's not an art form today, because nobody really kind of studies this type of rhetoric in depth like they did. I mean, it should. There's still emotional manipulation, though, today. There's still a way to do things like what's going on in the outside world right now, and there's still a way to emotionally manipulate people who are already kind of on the fence about what they believe, in a program called Quackaholics Anonymous, where sophistry continues to live on. And now that my voice is running out, I'm going to have to hit caffeine. In these slogans, in these steps, in these spiritual riddles that demand you obey, but they don't give you any real clarity, is what goes on in Quackaholics Anonymous. Because when language is used to obscure truth, not in the style of people like Cicero or Plato or the other ancient Greek philosophers, in fact, there's a lot of lesser known ones that I ought to bring up in these videos because they have really good contributions to how to think critically. Language becomes a maze in AA. It becomes a maze of double talk. It becomes a maze of confusion. It's almost like that H.P. Lovecraft horror story about Azathoth, who, by the way, is called the blind idiot god. I think that's what the AA higher power is. We'll just call it the blind idiot god. But it lives in a blight of nethermost confusion, which is pretty much what AA becomes by engaging in sophistry and convincing you of a whole bunch of things that you had no good reason to believe. Because sophists also knew how to sound wise without saying anything at all. I did talk about this in Sobriety Bestie's video. There was a writer, Daniel Dennett. He called it deepity. And deepity is when you say something that sounds really profound and it doesn't have any meaning at all when you examine it closely. Like when it says, hereafter in this drama of life, God is our director. That really sounds profound and deep, but it doesn't tell you shit about what that means, without any clarity whatsoever. AA does the same thing as the sophist does. It uses paradoxes, false paradoxes, and emotional manipulation, circular logic. The early AA writers did the same exact thing with a lot of loaded phrases and a lot of implied threats. Going through these notes pretty fast. Consider passages that say we become crushed by self-imposed crisis. We could not postpone or evade. When we became alcoholic, crushed by self-imposed crisis, well, we had to believe in God because we had no other choice. God is or he isn't. That's not really an invitation. That's not really telling you attraction rather than promotion. It's coercion, and it's wrapped up in all this pious prose. Or that the claim that I talked about recently, if we're disturbed, there's something wrong with us, or there's no such thing as justified anger. These are sweeping edicts about emotion, about morality, and they're delivered as some sort of spiritual axiom, but they're really nothing more than rhetorical traps. They tell you that if you're in doubt or if you feel natural human anger, the defect lies in you. It doesn't address the complexities of anger or why anger is a part of the human experience. And and think about, I lost my place on the notes, sorry. Because these notes are a hodgepodge mess. I might need to get them more organized in the future, but like when you hear people say, you are not responsible for your disease, but you are responsible for your recovery. That's what Daniel Dennett would call a deepity. That is what the sophist would use as a good way to manipulate you emotionally. I'm tangling all over my tongue. But if you think about that, you're not responsible for your disease, but you are responsible for your recovery. It's one of those lines where when you hear it in an AA meeting, everybody goes, like that. It sounds really profound. It sounds really deep. It kind of bats power back over to you. But upon closer examination, it's bullshit. Resentment is the number one offender out of how many? I mean, how many offenders do we have? And how do we have an offender if we have a disease? I mean, like I can't take penicillin. I'm allergic to it. There is no offender. You either take penicillin and you get sicker, or you don't take penicillin and you don't get sicker, and you take an alternative like doxycycline. But there is no, this is an offense against penicillin in your allergy. I mean, of course, first it's an allergy, then it's a disease, then it's turning your back on God, then it's something else. If you're disturbed, something's wrong with you. You must surrender to win. These phrases sound really profound, but they're just riddles. They just create confusion, and they don't give you any kind of clarity. They demand you be silent and not try to understand. Surrender to win. This is a classic sophist false paradox, because it's not really a paradox at all on closer examination, and it's disorienting to any kind of logic. What does it mean to surrender? What does it mean to give up? What does it mean to submit? What does it mean to win? You can't graduate. You can't get out of this. You got a lifelong disease that's going to kill you at any given moment if you don't keep kissing the ass of the blind idiot God of AA. So what is it you're winning exactly? Does it mean to heal? Does it mean to grow? The phrase implies that obedience is the path to victory, kind of like 1984, freedom is slavery. But it never defines what the victory is. It's a slogan, and it's designed to shut down questioning, and sophists of ancient Greece would know exactly how to use this to have a whole crowd of people roaring with approval over some half-assed concept. Think about this. You're not responsible for your disease, but you are responsible for your recovery. Well, that's a bit of a false binary. It creates guilt. You're not responsible for your disease, but you are responsible for your recovery. You've kind of created guilt in the person if they fall short, while you're denying them any agency over their own lives. You're told you have no control over your addiction. None. But total responsibility for your healing. So if you don't heal, it's all your fault. Even though you have an addiction, that's not your fault. If you examine that really closely, you can tell that it's bullshit. That's not empowerment, by the way. That's not winning. That's just a trap. Okay, page number 6 on the note here. And how about in the 12 and 12, where Bill W. repeatedly claims that our suffering comes from natural desires being warped. He says that we want too much food, too much sex, too much comfort. But this isn't really psychology. This is just moralism, and it's dressed all up as some profound insight. Who decides what we need, by the way? Who defines the threshold of what's acceptable hunger, what's acceptable intimacy, or what's acceptable longing? Here we go with more sophistry bullshit again. Sweeping assertions that sound profound and wise, and pronouncements and generalizations about this is what's wrong with you, but it totally collapses under scrutiny. Sweeping assertions that mean nothing. Plato would have seen this as what he called a corruption of language. That is why the men who studied language as an art form, as a means and a pathway to truth, someone like Cicero or Plato, had such a problem with the sophist, because the sophist were doing exactly what Bill W. is doing. They could just manipulate crowd control, whereas Plato saw this as a corruption of language. He believed that people were shaped by reason, by desire, not just restraints on their human nature. Aristotle himself said that virtue is balance, not compulsion, not suppression. Modern psychology tells us that excessive seeking often reflects deprivation, not moral failure. Which, by the way, I brought it up before, and I'll bring it up again. Gustave Le Bon, The Crowd. It's a 19th century book that talks very, very much about something that you might see going on outside in the world today with crowd manipulation, something the sophists knew how to do. And once you have a crowd that's roaring with approval for you, and you have a crowd that becomes an entity unto itself, it will do anything. How about AA literature moralizing about sex? And we're going to have a whole video about that in the future because this is bullshit and it needs to be done away with. It warns of instincts gone awry, and it treats desire as a defect unless really restrained. But human sexuality is neither God-given to misuse nor a sin to purge. There's a part in the big book where Bill W. says our sex instincts were God-given, therefore good. Well, okay, what do you mean by that? God-given, therefore good. Cancer. Is cancer God-given, therefore good? Is multiple sclerosis is multiple sclerosis God-given, therefore good? Is someone who's born maybe with a weak heart or someone who's born with certain types of health conditions that make their life a lot more harder for them than other people, is that therefore good? What is that supposed to mean? Biology and psychology show that orientation and desire emerge from complex factors and differ widely among individuals. There is no gold standard for how sex is conducted or how it's supposed to be done. From Aristotle's vision of eudaimonia to Simone de Beauvoir's explorations of embodied freedom, philosophers remind us that pleasure and longing, they're not moral failings. They're essential aspects of human flourishing, human conditioning, human condition. Even jealousy or passionate excess belongs to the spectrum of normal, and I lost my note. Normal experiences. That should have been easy to finish the sentence, But to condemn sexuality as a spiritual flaw is really to deny human beings what they already have. There is no, the only really important discussion about sex that needs to be had is consent. If you're willingly engaging in sex, then I don't really see a problem with it. But Bill W. doesn't frame it like that. He frames it as we are all Jeffrey Epstein. We'd hardly be human if we weren't. What does he mean by a sex problem here? It kills me that a program like AA that puts an almost anti-sex attitude allows people like Jeffrey Epstein to flourish in those rooms. They don't have the large scale. They don't have the amount of resources and money to do the things they do. But if you're a creepy 20-year-old timer who's above the law in AA, you can get away with manipulating anybody who's fresh out of treatment. You can get away with just doing anything to people. But of course, they always have a get-out-of-jail-free card on something like this because they can just say, we're all sick in here. It's funny, you're responsible for your recovery, but we're all sick in here. More sophistry, folks. Maslow's hierarchy, I'm not exactly sure how 100% I agree with it, but it reminds us that humans need love, they need belonging, they need esteem. They don't just need sobriety. Trauma theory shows that compulsive behavior sometimes arises from unmet needs, but it's not moral defects. Attachment science theorizes and speculates that longing for connection is just a biological imperative. And philosophically, Aristotle saw desire as a part of human flourishing. Nietzsche warned against slave morality where guilt is used to control people. Simone Weil, or is it Weil? I don't know. W-E-I-L. In some of her work, she was talking about how true attention means seeing suffering without imposing narratives on the suffering. sex is not bad or good. It just is. But it's only when we frame it as some shameful, nasty, unspeakable thing that it becomes so. AA imposes narratives, and it does it with all kinds of manipulative sophistry. It demands that you got to rewrite your trauma as some sort of moral failing rather than actual trauma. It tells you that your desires are warped, that we suffer because we want too much. Maybe we're suffering because we've been denied too much. Did they ever think of that? Our natural desires are warped because we want food and sex and all that. Maybe we've been denied basic comfort. Maybe we've been denied human connection. Maybe we come from a trauma background where there was no love, where there was no comfort, where there was no intimacy without moral conditioning. Maybe that's why we're suffering. But Bill doesn't take that into consideration, does he? He just makes this moral pronouncement, sex is bad, and wanting food is bad, even though Bill W. smoked himself to death and really liked screwing around on his wife and said more or less, well, Lois is just a mother to me. He's the one telling us that we don't have the authority to have bodily autonomy over our own lives and make decisions about what we want to do sexually. Maybe people have been denied safety. Maybe people have been denied connections and dignities. And maybe they've been denied a pathway to find their own truths. It's funny, they'll tell you, get a God of your understanding. But then they tell you exactly what that God is. You're not allowed to have a journey. You're not allowed to look at the world and say, hey, I'd like to know what I really think about all of this. Without the narratives, without the crushing condemnation. Desire is not an enemy. It's a signal that something, that we want something. And maybe it can be something sacred inside of us that refuses to settle for suppression and silence. You're not broken because you want more. You're not broken because you want some security. You're not broken because you turn the news on and see what's happening out here, but you say to yourself, this is terrifying to me because I don't know what the implications of all of this is to the people I care about. That's called human, being human. And humanity is not a defect. It's what you are as a person. What you are as a person is up to you to figure out and decide. You're the one who has to figure out your own pathway to truth, not rhetoric, not condemnation, not being told, oh, you got an addiction because you were having problems coping with trauma, because you've been denied maybe what you would like in life, and maybe it's been taken from you, or maybe something is just blatantly unfair, and maybe that is why your addiction's happening. No, you get caught into an addiction, and then you're just told, you're a bad person because I said so, and the big book said so, which means nothing. Just remember that when Plato said when rhetoric is used to not find the truth, when it's used to obscure truth, people suffer. And I think there's nothing more clear than that in the rooms of Quackaholics Anonymous, where truth becomes a weapon. You don't need to surrender to win. You need to see through the fog, and you need to reclaim your own voice and your own agency over your own life. The cult's very foundation is described in the first tradition, which insists fitting in at the cult is unity. Personal recovery depends upon a unity. In other words, it depends on the group. There was this old bastard who used to sit in meetings and he'd say, see, the first tradition means the program comes first. The individual comes second. Right then and there, I don't know if he realized it, that should be the call for everybody to step up who's new and walk out and say, well, you know what? I came here because I had a drinking problem. I didn't come here so I could be second, so the program could come first. I didn't come here to join a fucking hive mind. Whether or not, which also, by the way, is disguised, is more sophistry. It'll try to tell you that this is all about if the group is unified, then we'll all heal. But it doesn't really tell you what that means. It just tells you that the cult comes over you. It doesn't tell you anything else, which actually is leading me to my subscriber comment for this week as I wrap this video up. And they write, whether or not Bill intended for this to mean anything goes as at the cult, I have no idea. Although long has such an attitude been the norm in AA and widely accepted in AA, I've heard many instances where the phrase, well, if she needed to do that to stay sober, that's fine. In every case, whatever that is wasn't ever mentioned outright, rather than a rotten, if not illegal, and or heinous behavior was referred to in vague, almost secretive ways. I know exactly what they're talking about here before I finish the comment. I've seen people engage in all kinds of reprehensible behavior, and then someone will say, well, maybe they just needed to do that to stay sober. Yeah, right. That's when it's funny, this program makes moral pronouncements, but then morals go out the window when it comes to staying sober. So if staying sober goes above everything else, then it's not a moral program at all, is it? The longer I'm away from AA, the better I am. Also, the longer I'm away from AA, the more aware I become of just how rotten AA is and how much I loathe AA. I'm not, nor will I ever be ashamed to admit this. I won't be needing to make any stupid, silly, bloody amends to AA for helping to shine a much-needed light on everything that's so terribly wrong about AA. In summation, AA sucks dogs' balls. But anyway, I think that's about enough for this particular episode, and go around, chime in on the comments, let me know what you think, and tell me, do you think, Sobriety Bestie did say when I brought up the term deepity, she said they needed to change Alcoholics Anonymous to Deepity Anonymous, and I agree. See you guys next time.